Hi everybody! So I've had a couple of comments about my lack of use of stitch markers. I don't use stitch markers. I've never really evolved crocheting to use stitch markers, and as a result I've kind of developed methods of doing things that don't incorporate stitch markers. But I can understand how those of you who have used them in the past or do tend to use them in your work might get a little lost sometimes when you're trying to follow one of my patterns or work along with me when you have trouble identifying the start point. A start point, when I say that, is when I'm specifically working in the round on something. So this guy's made in the round. For the Amigurumi Sunshine was made in the round, like his face was made in the round, and as a matter of fact, so were his star points. They were made in the round too. When I say in the round, I mean just one continual circle, basically. When I work in the round, basically I come full circle and then I just keep going. And I have always identified that by looking at the top of my work and noting that there's always a bit of a bump, almost sort of like a teardrop shape, where the stitch from the end of the first row becomes joined to the very beginning of the second row. However, if you're not used to doing that, there's a very simple way of continuing to make the patterns along with me by using a stitch marker, so you don't have to move the stitch marker. I know a lot of people make patterns where you move the stitch marker for every single row. You don't have to do that with my patterns. You just need to know, it's like navigating by the North Star. You just need to know where your North Star is, and then you're fine for the rest of the pattern. So I'm going to show you today how to make a better note of your North Star stitch so that you can navigate the patterns with me as we crochet along. I've already made a small version because this is sort of the size that I usually work in. And what I've done is I've taken a safety pin and I've attached it to the front of the first stitch of my first row in a cinched circle. This first stitch marked allows me, when I'm working, to look at it from the side, look at it from the top, and know that when I've gone all the way around, when I come up here, a direct line up from that stitch marker or that stitch is the beginning of the row. The importance of this is twofold, really. You want to be able to count how many rows you've done, and also when you're increasing, you kind of end up losing stitches. You end up backing up. So for example, I increased 3 rows here. So instead of, when I finished increasing, I wasn't in a direct line with my start. I was actually back here. You always end up having to add a few extra stitches in order to become flush with your start point. If you always want to start your increases in the same place, that's fine. If you want to add them all back at the end, that's fine. I will tell you, when we're making one of my patterns, when you can and cannot align your increases with your start row, because sometimes when you want a particular three-dimensional shape, you have to be very careful where you put your increases. So you may still be doing increase rows, but you may have to cram all your increases at sort of one side or the other, and that will greatly define the shape, the overall shape when it's finished. But anyway, that's what it looks like when it's done, but now we're going to make one together. I'm going to use a really big hook and some really thick yarn, and I'm going to make a cinched circle. And when we make a cinched circle, we wrap the yarn around our fingers and create a loop like that. We take our hook, we go through the loop, grab the yarn, and pull it back. And before you let go of everything, you wrap the yarn around your hook and you pull it back through that loop, and that secures everything. So into this cinched circle, I am going to put 8 single crochets. There's 1. There's 2, and I'm just going to cinch up my circle a little bit. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so now this is the end of what would be my first row. Typically, I say, okay, now you cinch it shut. So you grab that short tail, you cinch the circle shut, and that effectively brings your last stitch around to meet up with your first stitch. This is the stitch, this one right here, that I base all of my beginning and ends of rows on from here on out. If you can't see it, the easiest thing to do is this. Take a safety pin, again, for the sake of demonstration, I found a big one. Open up your safety pin or your stitch marker, and instead of going through the top, see this is the top of the stitch, but I have to work into the top of the stitch, so I don't want to interrupt that. Instead, I'm going to attach the safety pin to the front. And that's those two little stripes there, those two little cross sections of yarn. That's the front of the stitch. I'm not going to touch it with the crochet hook, so I'll just close up my safety pin and let it hang there for the rest of my work. So now I can continue. I'm going to now single crochet 2 times into every single stitch around, which will be an end of 16. So I act like the stitch holder isn't there, and I put my 2 single crochets into that stitch, and then 2 into the next stitch. Okay, so now I've come around almost to the very beginning again, and I know, for example, that this is the start stitch, and if I look at the 2 stitches I put into it, I can tell that that was the very beginning of my row. So this next stitch would be the beginning of my 3rd row. But you'll notice that this is 1 stitch off the direct top. And because when I make things in the round, I always count the exact number and then start again and count the exact number and start again and count the exact number. And I might wind up back here a couple places, but I always add a few extra single crochet or stitches at the very end of the piece just to flatten it out. So I'm going to continue increasing because I'm going to make this, say, 3 rows of increase. So my 3rd row is going to be a pattern of 2 single crochets into the first stitch, a single crochet into the next stitch, and then 2, 1, 2, 1 all the way around. And 3 times 8 is 24. 23 and 24. Now, you'll notice that I am quite a ways back from my beginning stitch. That's because every time you increase, when you finish that increased row, you end up a bit further back than you intend to. So if I was going to continue in a tube, and I will, so no more increasing, just a tube, I'm going to do a few rows of just regular old single crochet. 3 in total, actually, and I'll see you at the end. Okay, so I'm just coming up on the end of my 3rd row, and I know that by counting row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, row 5, row 6. So I did 3 rows of increase and then 3 rows of regular single crochet. Now I don't bother counting when I'm going around and around and around, but I know that that's my start point, and if I want this to sit flat on the ground, I need to keep crocheting, so I don't have to count, I just have to keep crocheting and checking. So there's my start point, so I'm going to put in 2 more. 1, 2. Now, it looks like this. That was my start point. Actually, you know what? I'm going to back it up a little bit. This is my start point here. This was my first stitch. And I usually use, I don't know if you can see it, but maybe you can because I'm pointing to it with the end of the pin here. This little space where it turns from the first row into the second row is the space, that little mark there, that little bump, is the space that I use, the notation that I use to indicate my top row. Because I've marked my first stitch with a pin, it sort of changes my direction a little bit, but that's still fine because I have based all of my math and all of my balance on this mark going up as opposed to, say, this mark going up. And if I take my hook out, you'll notice that it sits nice and flat, it's completely even, and it doesn't matter from what direction I count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've got the exact number of stitches to create an even 6 rows all the way around. And that's basically how I do it. So that's it for that little tutorial. I just kind of wanted to share with you guys a simple way of marking your first stitch in your beginning row so that you can always use it as a start point if you have trouble seeing where your start point is, because I'm always referring to that in my pattern making. So for the future, and when you're done, obviously you just have to take out your safety pin or your stitch marker, and there you go. Easy to follow, very simple. If you have to, just mark it with a safety pin, and maybe I'll do a couple patterns down the road where I do mark it with a safety pin, just so you guys can see how I would do it in that case. And that's it. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask, because this is the sort of thing I love to hear about. Have a wonderful week. We will talk again very shortly, and keep stitching. Bye. I should make this into a little hat.